Hey y'all, welcome to Portland. Today we're sitting outside of a place that is not just a bookstore, it's a literary landmark. Powell's City of Books, occupying an entire block here on Burnside Street, is the world's largest independent new and used bookstore. With over 1 million books spread across 4 floors, Powell's is a maze of literary treasures. Each room color-coded and filled with everything from rare first edition books to popular bestsellers. It's a place where you can lose track of time and find something unexpected on every shelf. And today I'm going to go inside and pick one book from each level to see what kind of literary gems I can find. And I'm not just stopping at the flagship store downtown. I'll also be grabbing a book from their airport store and their smaller location on Hawthorne Street. I'm curious to see how these spots compare to each other and mostly just what we can find inside. So let's go. Powell's actually started in Chicago in 1970 when Michael Powell, a grad student at the University of Chicago, borrowed just $3,000 to open his first bookstore. It was such a success that he paid back the loan in just 2 months. His dad, Walter Powell, helped out one summer and loved it so much that when he moved back to Portland, he opened his own used bookstore. Walter had a habit of buying every used book he could find, and it didn't take long before he outgrew his first space and moved into a former car dealership on Burnside. If you look closely, you can still see a few hints of that old auto shop in the building today. In 1979, Michael joined his dad in Portland, and together they created something unique: shelves that blended new and used books, hardcovers and paperbacks side by side, open every day of the year, and staffed by book lovers who truly knew their stuff. Over 4 decades later, Powell's is still family owned, now run by third generation Emily Powell. So when you walk into Powell's today, you're not just browsing a bookstore, you're stepping into a living piece of Portland's history, a place that's been enriching the city's cultural and literary life for more than 50 years. Hello, we are back home in Austin now, and let's dive into the haul. But first we need to get coffee, so let's go get coffee. Thank you. At the flagship Powell store on Burnside, there are 8 divided rooms or sections, and they're all color coded. We first ended up in the purple room because that was adjacent to the coffee shop. So for kind of the purposes of how we mapped out this video, it's considered the second floor. So we were in the purple section first, which is the kind of a self-help area, the psychology. And I am extremely interested in psychology, specifically pertaining to couples and couples therapy. It is something that I am very passionate about. I love understanding communication styles between people and why people are motivated to do the things that they do. So I thought it would be interesting to pick up maybe a more couples oriented psychology book. One thing I love about Powell's is that there is a book for every single person at this bookstore. Specifically just in this aisle, they had a shelf dedicated to stories of survivors of domestic abuse. They had a section entirely dedicated to sex. They had a section entirely dedicated to sociology, psychology, self-help. They have everything, and it's all labeled very well, so you know exactly where to find what you're looking for. So the first book that I got technically on the second floor was Hold Me Tight by Dr. Sue Johnson. This book is basically about this approach to relationships that was originated by Dr. Sue Johnson. And according to the back, it says that other forms of couple therapy have been shown in studies to be only about 35% effective in healing relationships, but emotionally focused couple therapy, which was developed by Sue Johnson, has achieved an astounding 75% success rate. And it says 86% of couples report feeling happier in their relationships, and the results are long-lasting. So I am very intrigued to read this book. As someone who has been in a long-term relationship for 3.5 years, I'm no stranger to doing therapy speak with Jesse. I'm very interested in learning more about how to kind of sustain love and sustain a marriage for a long time. So I'm very, very interested in this, and hopefully it's good. I'm sure it will be, but if it is good, there's also a workbook that you can buy to do after this, and I love a workbook. I love an activity sheet of any kind. If I like the book, I'm definitely going to get that, and maybe I'll do a follow-up. Then we ended up on kind of the third floor, again, for purposes of this video, and I made my way to the young adult section because I was actually looking for a very specific book, because I, just like anybody else, succumb to trends all the time, and I want to know what people are talking about, and I hear about the series all the time. So I got the first book in the Powerless series by Lauren Roberts, and I'm really, really excited to read this. I've heard obviously a lot of good things about it. I know it is very, very popular on TikTok and social media in general. I know nothing about it other than it is a YA romance fantasy, and there's a dude named Kai in it. From the little that I've heard about this book, I think that it has a chance. Either way, I'm very excited to read it for this video. So that was the second book that I picked up. And then we made our way back down to the first floor, which has the green room, the gold room, and the blue room. So it's like 3 different sections kind of on this main floor. And this is where a lot of like new books, popular bestsellers tend to live. And I found my way over to the shelf that had best-selling fiction books. And there was a lot of good choices on that shelf. It was kind of hard for me to pick, but I saw Piranesi by Susanna Clarke and I knew immediately I had to pick up this book. This book has been on my TBR for a while, ever since I think it was Plant-Based Bride who I saw recommend this first, and now I've seen it, you know, kind of all over. I know a lot of people really enjoyed this book, and from what I've heard about it, it sounds very interesting. It sounds kind of like a labyrinth story, I think. Definitely fantasy, and sounded like vaguely reminiscent of House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I know that they're not the same, but just in my mind, that's the connection I made, so I'm definitely very excited to read this, and it seems like it'll be a pretty quick read, so I might honestly want to read this one first. I'm just really excited to know what it's about. And then the last book that I got at the flagship store was up on the top level, which is the Pearl Room, and this section is entirely nonfiction, and also they have a rare book room, and you could find anything up here. There's a section for art, for photography, for design, architecture, crafting, cooking, you name it, anything you have a desire to know about, it's there. And I ended up picking up this book called The Architecture of Happiness. I had a feeling I would probably end up finding some sort of architecture or design book, just because I am an interior designer after all, so, you know, by nature of my trade, that is something I'm interested in, and I do love architecture books, but I didn't just want a coffee table book. I wanted a book that I could actually read for this video and review to some extent the content. But this book is by Alain de Botton. It basically talks about our connection as humans to the world around us in terms of architecture and how spaces influence us psychologically, which is one of the main reasons why I got into design. Again, I'm very fascinated by psychology, and in particular the ways in which you can walk into a room and it makes you feel something deep inside you without you even realizing it necessarily. And that is kind of what I always strive to create, is a feeling of like home and of wonder for somebody inside their own house. It feels very special to me, and that is why design is so dear to me. So I thought that this seemed like the perfect book for me. Like, I picked it up and told Jesse what it was about, and he was like, that's perfect. You would probably love it. So that was the 4th book that I picked up.
Today, have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Let's go.
Yeah. Let's go. Got my shopping.
I'm a big reader.
You're funny. And that kind of concludes the main flagship store section of the books. But I didn't want to just stop there, because they have a second location on Hawthorne Street, which is only about like a 10-15 minute drive away, and it was on our way home. So I was like, we have to stop there, because I've never been to that one before. And while it's only 1 story compared to the flagship store's 4 stories, it is still huge. There is so much. Like, we walked in and I was like, oh, this is kind of small and like really cute, but it just keeps going. It's like a big long hallway, and they have a lot to offer there. It is just as cute and homey as the original Powell's is, maybe even more so cozy, just because you're kind of tucked in. It's not a huge store, but it was lovely there. And one of the first sections that I found myself in was the literature section, and the book that I ended up picking up was Sula by Toni Morrison. I have only read one Toni Morrison book before, and that was back in college, and it is Song of Solomon, but it is one of my favorite books. I love that book so much, and I love Toni Morrison's writing, and I'm honestly kind of upset with myself that I have not read more of her books since then, but I have heard wonderful things about Sula. It's pretty short, and so I decided that I would pick this up. They only had 2 copies of it in the whole store, so I got one, and I'm extremely excited to read it. So that is the book that I picked up at the Hawthorne location. Since there was only 1 floor, I only got 1 book, and I stayed true to that. I only did get 1 book, because at this point I was running out of luggage space. And then lastly, on Saturday we flew home, and Powell's also has an airport location. It is quite small. It's just like a small little bit of the wall and a couple of displays sort of out, but it was conveniently right across from the place we were getting coffee from, so I stopped in there to pick up a book at that location as well. I think we visited every location except for one that's in Beaverton, Oregon, I believe. I almost went to every single location of Powell's within 24 hours. One thing I'll say about the airport location is it had a wonderful variety of books despite its small size. I have been to several airport bookstores, and even ones that I feel have a larger selection did not have nearly as diverse of a section as this Powell's did. It had, I think, 6 or 7 main different sections. There was like kids books, sci-fi, fantasy, romance, nonfiction, literature. They had used books. They also had books on sale, and they had cute trinkets. Like, they had a very diverse selection, albeit a small one, but I do feel it's very representative of their kind of store and their brand identity, which is that any person can find a book at a Powell's location. So I definitely think they should pride themselves on their diversity because it's not something I've experienced in other airport bookstores. Mostly even Book People in Austin's airport, which I love Book People. I don't really tend to stop there because most of the books that they offer are just like book talk books or popular bestsellers, not necessarily books that I want to read. Obviously I could find something, but I don't think they tend to have a very diverse selection. So all that to say, I did find a book there as well. One also that has been on my TBR for a while, and that is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. And I've heard general acclaim for it. So when I saw it on the shelf, I just immediately beelined and was like, that's the book I'm gonna get. I don't even need to keep looking. So I'm very excited to read this. I don't really know anything about it. All I know is that it has something to do with like a climate change situation. I don't know if it's like a postmodern type world or if it's still in our current world. But yeah, that's all I know about it. I'm very, very, very excited to read all of these books. So yeah, I mean, this is basically my TBR for the next probably 2 or 3 weeks. I'm going to try my best to read them all as fast as I can, but I always love doing these sort of longer form review videos. So I think I'm going to pick the first book. I usually kind of try to vary them in terms of content, so I'm not reading sort of like the same thing back to back to back. So I'll probably want to split up Sula and Parable of the Sower, and maybe I'll split up the nonfiction books too. So I'm going to get my Powell's bookmark and get reading. Hello, it has been several days since we last checked in. It is now Friday, and I think when we last spoke, it was sometime last weekend. I actually can't even remember. Since we last spoke, I absolutely devoured Piranesi. I finished this book in less than 24 hours. And I am also already halfway through Parable of the Sower. So we have a lot of catching up to do. Decided to go ahead and pick up Piranesi because I thought it would really hold my attention, and it most certainly did. I was obsessed with it. This was a 5-star book for me, and I actually have not read a 5-star book in a while, not since like the beginning of May, I think. So it was very refreshing, and I absolutely adored it. This book is about a man seemingly named Piranesi who has been living in a labyrinth. His time in this labyrinth seems to be all he knows. He is a diligent note taker, observing and mapping out the labyrinth, and it's like 900 halls long in every direction. So it's basically endless. Like there is no end to this thing, and seemingly there is no way out. And as far as Piranesi knows, the only inhabitants of this house are him and one other person called the Other, who he regularly meets for an hour twice a week to discuss their exploration of the great and powerful magic that exists in this world that needs to be harnessed so that they can control lesser-minded individuals. The first half of this book is a whirlwind, and I loved every second of it. The first half of this book was actually my favorite part of the book, just trying to unravel the mystery of why he's there and learn about the world, so much world building. I know that some people found the beginning of the book to kind of drag for them, but it was quite the opposite for me. It was truly my favorite part. I was tabbing everything like, okay, this is a clue. Like, what does this mean? I loved just the level of confusion. Like, we are almost like detectives trying to figure out what's going on. And similarly to Piranesi, we don't necessarily know how to catalog all of the information that we're receiving, like the clues that we're receiving about what's going on. So we're kind of like there. I had a whole tab color, this pink one, that literally just says question marks, come back to this. And I used that thoroughly because there were so many things that I knew I needed to go back to after we had solved the mystery, after the book was over, to figure out what the heck was going on. I loved in one of the more opening chapters, there is a flood coming through the house and Piranesi is like getting caught in the waves and he's able to grab up onto a statue and like pull himself up out of the water, and he praises the house for offering him this saving grace of the statue that was able to get him out of the flood. And I was like, this is so ironic. He has like a very deep religious connection to this house, but also the house was just trying to kill him with this flood like 5 seconds prior. So I very quickly caught on to this very different reality that I was experiencing and Piranesi was experiencing. And that's something that continues throughout the whole book. We view him being sort of trapped in this house as horrible. It's almost like he's impoverished being there, and we can imagine what that would be like, but his perspective, on the other hand, is quite lovely of the things around him. He considers himself a scientist and an explorer, and he goes around cataloging things meticulously in his journals, everything that happens to him. He tends to have a pretty positive outlook on what's going on around him because it's really all he's ever known. He has no memory of the time that he might have spent outside of this house prior to when his journals start. There are so many juicy themes happening in this book. It touches on class disparity a little bit and the idea of like controlling and dominating lesser individuals or lesser intellects. There is a huge central theme of knowledge, which is something that has come up on this channel before. On one hand, the other is in this pursuit of knowledge and control of both Piranesi, but also the house in general. They meet for the other to basically learn what Piranesi has cataloged throughout his journey of all of these halls. So he wants to be able to learn more about this house without actually doing the work. So there is the pursuit of knowledge in that way. But sort of on the more opposite side, there are later points in the book where Piranesi comes across information that could very drastically change who he is, his perspective of the world around him. And there are also like clues that he comes across in his time in the house. And it's so funny to see his reaction because it's almost like he's closed off to wanting to discover what these things are. He considers himself a scientist and an explorer and is in pursuit of understanding this house that he considers divine. But when it comes to these clues of things that don't necessarily make sense to him or might threaten his worldview, it is almost like he's like, nah, I don't think that really has anything to do with me. Like, I'm gonna keep going. Like, it's so interesting. And I loved it because I feel like it is not a perspective that I have necessarily explored in a novel before. So I thought it was so intriguing. I did a lot of writing in the book about that particular theme, unwillingness to learn new information. And most of the times I feel it was truly just subconscious. Like, his brain isn't attuned to the conflict that he's dealing with in the way that we are as like external readers. It was so interesting. And that theme sort of dives into like complacency within our status in life, or like complacency within our surroundings, not necessarily yearning for something different or better. And sometimes that's to his benefit, and it might be to ours as well. There's definitely a spiritual or religious connection that's explored between Piranesi and this house or labyrinth that he's in. He often refers to himself as a divine child of the house. It really had me thinking that this book might be a religious allegory of some kind. I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later, but there were some interesting moments that really kind of solidified that feeling that this house is a spiritual place to him. There's a moment where he has all of these like shells and things that he's found in the house that he's woven through his hair as it's gotten longer, and there's a moment in the book where he has to take them out, and he describes it as he's feeling stripped and like naked in a way. It felt akin to like somebody forgetting to wear like a cross, like that symbol, that iconography of something that's meaningful to you being stripped away. There was so many moments like that that really honed in on what I felt to be like a very religious connection to this house that was very interesting to explore, especially when he considers himself kind of a scientist. Like, it seems like those two things are at war sometimes, but somehow it works, and I was obsessed with it. There was definitely a theme of other people, how they can actually shape our view of the world, and sometimes it's for the worse, which I thought was actually really interesting. And kind of at the central core of this book, there is a big theme of identity and memory. This book made so many connections to other media I have consumed, one in particular being the movie Memento by Christopher Nolan. If you guys have never seen that movie, I highly recommend. It was Christopher Nolan's first film, and I still consider it to this day one of the most inventive movies I have ever seen. If you have not seen it, it's basically a movie playing in reverse, but not fully in reverse because it's by scene. So like the very last scene of the movie is the first thing you see, and then we work our way backwards towards the very beginning, scene by scene. And I remember writing in this book somewhere that Piranesi's memory is really kind of at play here. We learn pretty quickly that there are definitely parts of his memory that he does not have access to. And so the way that this whole mystery sort of unravels piece by piece, almost like it's working backwards, like we're working backwards, putting all the pieces together, it gave me the same feeling in my brain as when I saw Memento for the first time, and I loved it. Like, it was so cool. Ultimately, at the core of this book, I feel like the message that it was trying to give us is that true fulfillment seems to come from seeing beauty in the world and seeing connections in the world in front of you, not necessarily our pursuit of knowledge or dominating others. It truly is just being happy and content, being able to see the beauty in all of the ordinary things that we experience, which when I say it out loud sounds cliche, but that is what makes this book so good, because this book seems like a mystery about a man stuck in a labyrinth, and yet somehow it has this beautiful message at its core that just like creeps up on you throughout the entirety of the book. And that whole section at the end of the book with what happens very much made me feel, it gave me similar vibes to Room. If you guys have ever read that book, I can't necessarily like talk about why it gave me those vibes without spoiling it, but there was just so many interesting threads interwoven at the end, so much that Susanna Clarke was saying without actually really having to say it, that I was so shocked. I was like, I picked up this book because I thought it was a cool, like, weird psychological mystery, and then it ended up turning out to be like a very self-reflective, I don't even know how to describe it, like psychological, but in a completely different way than I was expecting it to be. It was just so good. And on the topic of the religious allegory, I went down a Reddit wormhole, and there was a wonderful poster on Reddit who kind of saw religious connections with the text in this book. So I'll put it up here because I don't remember their username, but it was very, very enlightening. He basically put like side-by-side comparisons of sentences or passages from the book that were like not identical, but so close in like structure and word usage to passages from the Bible that it feels like it was purposeful. It was so interesting to have that element there, but be kind of hidden down in the background. Like you have to know it in order to see the connection, right? So I feel like this book can connect with people who are religious, but also those who are non-religious. There were a lot of people who I saw on Reddit talking about this book saw it as sort of more of an allegory for mental health. So I feel like it's wonderful in that way that it can connect with so many people who have so many different ideological beliefs. I just thought it was really interesting. And the last thing I want to mention about the book, I read in another article that Susanna Clarke actually suffers from chronic fatigue syndrome, and this significantly impacted her ability to write for a period of time, and often like periods of her just being housebound and like suffering with depression. And it is so clear to me now, knowing that a lot of the themes in this book were influenced by her experience with that, especially with the themes of isolation and confinement. And it really just makes the message of this book so much more powerful, that despite our circumstances, we can focus on the good and the beauty of things in the world. To me, it was like keeping losing the atmosphere of like childlike wonder in your heart for the things around you. We become so jaded, and I feel like it happens so much sooner now for us, like as we get older, as generations go by. Let's be real, like the world is kind of a shit show right now, and it has been for a while. It's not really that fun to be here sometimes, but we can choose to be the arbiters of our own happiness. Again, as cliche as it sounds, we can choose to look at our situations differently and to find the simplistic beauty in the world around us. And for me, I often do that through reading. I have learned to slow my life down a lot more. I don't really spend any time on social media besides YouTube, obviously, but I feel like that doesn't count. This year, reading really took off as a hobby for me. I have really tried to enjoy that like simple pleasure of life and the beauty that each new story brings to me. And that perspective shift and priority shift has really changed my life for the better. So not to get all preachy on you guys, but that's just something that this book really kind of revealed to me that I thought was sweet. I mean, this book was a 5-star book if it wasn't obvious. So after I finished Piranesi, I picked up Parable of the Sower. And again, I'm about halfway through. So yeah, I won't say too much more, but I'll be back very soon to tell you more about my thoughts on this book. Hello. It has been a couple days, actually many days. It's been like a week and a half since I talked to you last. I have been moving through this reading list a little bit slower than I anticipated, but I'm trying to give myself grace. It's a lot to try to read 6 books within a couple weeks. That's not really realistic for me, and some of these books are a little long, but I'm here. It is now Wednesday the following week. It's actually been a week and a half since I finished both The Parable of the Sower and Hold Me Tight. So I'm going to wrap up both of these books. And in that time, I have been reading Powerless for the last week and a half, which is why I've allowed so much time to pass without updating you guys on the books. I'm still reading that book. It's a long book, but I'm almost done. So I needed to wrap up my thoughts on these other 2 books before I could move on. So I actually finished both of these books last week, and I think on Sunday. I basically kind of read them in tandem. I think I'll talk about Parable of the Sower first. This book is often described as a modern classic of dystopian literature, and honestly, reading it in 2025 felt a little too real. It's kind of freaky that Butler wrote this in the 90s, and yet so much of what she imagined feels like it's really only so many steps removed from where we are right now. It's just kind of wild that she was able to look into the future with such perception of what could happen to our country. At its core, this book is about survival and like found family, like finding community and belief. We kind of explore the way that communities are formed in sort of these lawless situations where like everything else is stripped away, like what still brings people together, how do we still form bonds with each other. And it also touches on obviously the very like stark reality of how resources are hoarded and like stripped away from the poor, like withheld from them simply because, you know, they don't have money or means of access. There's also this underlying tension kind of earlier on in the book between people who want to prepare for the future, like Lauren, and those who choose to sort of turn a blind eye and just like be complacent, hoping that things will just somehow get better when they clearly will not, like, which feels very like don't look up coded. So I thought that was interesting. And then of course there's the biggest theme of religion. Lauren's creation of Earthseed is central to the story. I found it interesting that it's like a faceless, flexible spirituality instead of like religion as most religions as we know it, which are like very rigid systems built around a central deity. So that was really thought-provoking how different the concept of faith and God was. I can definitely see how people who are not religious resonated with those themes themes, those concepts, the emphasis on like community and responsibility, like considering how our actions affect others and ripple out into the world, that really resonated with me. So I liked those aspects of Earthseed. One thing I definitely found compelling is how Butler leans into the actual parable from the Bible that the title comes from. In the New Testament, the parable of the sower is a story about a farmer who's like sowing seeds, and some of them fall into thorns and get choked out. Some of them fall on like rocky ground, so they never grow, and some fall on like good soil and they grow and they flourish. So the whole point is that not every seed will take root, but the ones that do grow into something strong and sustaining. So in Butler's version of this book, Lauren is the sower, fitting that her religion is called Earthseed, very on the nose, and she's going through this destroyed, like chaotic version of America, and she's sharing her philosophy of Earthseed with anyone who will listen. And just like in the parable, not everyone will listen. Some people just dismiss it outright. There are some who, based on whatever their like emotional or environmental circumstances, like they just don't have the conditions to want to hold on to it, and others do resonate with it, embrace it, and join her in this faith. So I love that the parable isn't just a clever title. It really is a metaphor that's like a major through line throughout the entire book, all the way to the last page. My only qualm is that I do wish the religious element was explored deeper, I guess I should say, because it obviously is explored a lot in this book, but I wish it had been explored a little bit more deeply in the narrative, instead of what I felt like a majority of it was it sort of showing up in like quotes at the beginning of each chapter, and we really don't actually hear her talking about it to people until the second half of the book. I just, for me personally, wanted to get a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty details of this religion, and maybe that is the point, that it's not supposed to be like that. I get that it's supposed to be very loose. She's also 15, so like she doesn't have it all figured out either. But I think in terms of what Butler was trying to say about it, I did want it to be a little bit more developed from that angle. My one other qualm is that the pacing was definitely a little bit slow. I would say that the climax of the book is really happens in the very middle of the book and sort of sets the motion for the second act. So for that reason, I found myself wanting the ending to go a little bit further in terms of the plot, like to have a bigger punch, like a bigger moment after everything that we had been working towards. Like there's so much anticipation of what is to come, what we could have potentially gotten to at the end of this novel, and we just didn't go as far as I wanted us to in terms of the progress in the story. It was definitely impactful. I still liked it, and the metaphorical connection, again back to the actual parable, was great, but it just felt a little anticlimactic to me. That said, it does set up the second book very well, which I will definitely be reading. It's actually in the mail on the way here. But I do have to say, this is a small rant. I am so annoyed. Both the afterword by N.K. Jemisin and like the conversations with the author, with Octavia E. Butler after that, they both spoiled what I can only assume are like two major plot points in the second book, which I don't understand why. Like why would they include that in this edition? Like, do they assume that any person who is picking up this new edition already read the series and knows what happened? Or am I supposed to not read the afterword? Or like, I always read the stuff that's at the end of a book. Why would they put spoilers in there? Is that like a common thing that I just didn't know about? I don't know, but I'm really kind of annoyed about that. So just a forewarning for at least this edition, if you are deciding to pick it up for the first time, don't read the afterword or the conversations with the author at the end, because you'll get a spoiler. Anyways, rant over. Overall, I'm really glad that I read this book. It's not going to be an all-time favorite for me personally. I know a lot of people ride hard for this book and they love it. I really enjoyed it. It just needed to be a little bit more developed for me personally in a couple different areas. It's definitely one of those books that makes you sit with big questions and thoughts about survival at the most basic level, also just about like belief in general, whether you're religious or not, and like connection and community that we should have with each other given the current state of our world. I think that it really emphasizes compassion that we really should be focusing on right now. And I feel like it's always going to be relevant. It'll probably be more relevant as the years continue to progress. So all that being said, I gave it 4 stars. It didn't have that certain sprinkle of something that makes it 5 stars for me for, the reasons that I outlined already, but it was still very good, and I'm super excited to read the sequel. I can't wait to see what happens because there's so many things we're building towards. I need to know what's going on. Okay, and then shortly after I finished Parable, I finished Hold Me Tight by Sue Johnson. I really just was kind of picking it up here and there. I did a lot of skimming through this book. I still absorbed most of the content, but I have thoughts about it because I picked it up and put it down 3 or 4 separate times, and I really didn't think I was going to finish it at one point. Like I mentioned before, this is a nonfiction book about conflict within couples, diving into like real world examples, and it definitely gave me a lot to think about and reflect on. The most interesting part of the book by far and away is kind of the earlier sections that dive into attachment theory, something that has definitely blown up in recent years and become super popular. What's funny is while I was reading this book, I went to a friend's birthday party and we were all out eating. It was mostly girls like sitting at our section of the table, but Jesse and I were there, and somehow we got onto the topic of attachment theories, me and my friend, and she started asking like, oh, what's your attachment style? What's your attachment style? What's your attachment style? And literally like 5 or 6 people down the table, they all knew their attachment styles and were saying them. And Jesse, when we got home, was like, that is so funny that all of you guys just knew the answer. Like, you know about this thing. It's very popular now. I didn't really learn about it until I think like last year, but it's really interesting if you guys have not looked into it. It definitely provides a lot of insight into kind of how you deal with conflict in relationships. So I'll leave a link actually to the test down below if you're interested in taking it. But anywho, she talks about how in the 50s when John Bowlby like first kind of discovered or came up with this theory of attachment styles, it was like widely rejected, and now it's super popular. I thought that was really interesting. Johnson kind of ties the romantic attachment that we have with our lovers to the same kind of attachment that a mother has with its baby. She pulls in a lot of research and data to kind of support this point, which I thought was super interesting. She basically implies that our like fights with our lovers or our partners aren't actually really about the surface level issue that we're fighting about, whether it's money or chores or whatever it is, but at its deepest level, like within us, it's really triggering one or more of like 3 main questions, which is, do I feel safe with you? Do I feel loved by you? And do I feel emotionally connected to you? So that framework I thought was super interesting and thought-provoking. It talks a lot about that in kind of the first section, and I ended up tabbing quite a few like points of data that I thought were really interesting. So that was kind of the highlights for me. That said, I did not find this book the easiest to read. It's quite long, and honestly I think it could have been a lot more concise, either much shorter or like a long research paper. I feel like Johnson was kind of making the same point over and over again. There's a lot of repetition, and I felt like if it had been a little bit tighter, it would have landed better for real couples or real people like me who are reading it and trying to actually apply it to their everyday lives. Speaking of that, while again the ideas in this book are compelling, I did find myself thinking like, how realistic is this actually for me to use in my life, especially in the middle of an argument or like difficult conversation with a partner? There's so much information loaded into this book and so many steps, like steps within steps within steps, that I just don't know that I could pull off this approach if I was like really heated. I'm trying to think if I was the type of person to like get into like all out fights with my partner. You know, some people do that, and I don't know that this method is that approachable from the perspective of this book. It almost feels like something that still needs the facilitation of a therapist or like a third party, or minimally you would need a lot of like referencing back to the book and practice rather than just, you know, expecting to read the book one time and suddenly be able to communicate better. Like, it just is not going to work like that. Otherwise, I would literally have to like keep the book open in the middle of an argument and like be flipping through the pages and be like, okay, we've identified our demon dialogue, now let's move on to the raw spots. Like, that's just not gonna happen. And then the last thing I'll say is that I noticed parts of this book definitely felt outdated. Some of the language that she used, like in particular what I'm thinking of is terms like gays and straights when referencing those groups of people. And overall, there wasn't really much diversity represented in the actual couples that she profiled, which was kind of a bummer. There was, I think, one gay couple, but other than that, everybody everybody was heteronormative, and there were a lot of examples of real world couples. So the lack of different perspectives just made me feel like some of those sections were a little limited compared to what more of like a modern approach to couples would look like. So overall, I love the sections on attachment theory and how it applies to romantic relationships. But in general, I don't think it was the most accessible or practical guide if you're looking for something that you can just pick up and like immediately use with your partner. It's dense, it is repetitive, and it requires a lot of work for you to do on your own before moving on through the sections. So the big picture ideas, like the root of every conflict, like is our need to feel secure and loved, like that I loved, that stuck with me, and I think it was a really powerful takeaway. Lots of interesting data, but overall it was just kind of like, again, it was just dense. It was a lot. So for that reason, I gave it 3 stars. So yeah, that was Hold Me Tight and Parable of the Sower. And now I'm going to keep reading Powerless. I'm really close to being done, and then I will see you guys when I finish it. Hello, I am back with a bagel. Just, in case you were wondering. It has been a couple days since we last spoke. It is now Friday morning, and in that time, I have finished Powerless. I finished it yesterday morning. I'm surprised how long it took me to read this. It was like a solid over a week and a half, but it's a pretty big book. I mean, it's like almost 500 pages, so that's, nothing small, but I have a lot of thoughts. This book is about Peyton, who is an orphan that lives in the slums of Ilia, and in this world, there are ordinary people who do not have any magic, and then there are the elites who have magic. And they're ranked anywhere from like offensive to defensive to mundane. And the king of Ilia has basically condemned ordinaries. His claim is that their proximity to the elites will drain them of their magic, eventually making elites powerless. And for that reason, he has decreed that all of them should be killed should they be found out that they're ordinaries. There was a purging that happened a couple years ago that was basically to kill them all. And our main character, Peyton, is an ordinary living in secret, disguising herself as a psychic because she's very good at like being able to read people. So she basically fakes being a psychic in order to get by. And she lives in the slums with her best friend, Adina. And she often gets by having to rob people and steal things, as many do in the slums. She decides one day to rob our other main character, Kai, who she does not know at the time is a prince and the future enforcer of the army. So she robs him. He ends up getting attacked by a silencer, which is another type of magic that can like silence other people's magic. And so Peyton, not having a power, therefore not succumbing to the effects of the silencer, is able to fight him off and kind of save Kai. Then she realizes who he is, and the rest is history. Everything kind of ensues from there. So Peyton gets nominated to participate in what's called the Purging Trials alongside Kai and a few other elites. And this is basically a yearly event where it's very Hunger Games-esque. They participate in 3 trials. They basically have to survive. Although in this case, killing's not encouraged, but it's not allowed. So they basically have to go through these 3 trials, and whoever wins, brings honor to the kingdom. I don't really know. But this book basically follows Peyton getting drafted into the trials, her moment of like training for them, and then what happens during the actual trials themselves. This series has gotten a lot of hype recently, and I can see why. It was very fun. I had a lot of fun reading it. At its heart, this book's major theme is about kind of who holds power and who doesn't. We see this like oppressive regime against the ordinaries and propaganda being spread that keeps the elites and the ordinaries divided. So that kind of sows a lot of tension between the ordinaries and the elites. I definitely liked how this played out, and kind of from Peyton's perspective, especially in the first half, she's literally powerless. Like, she doesn't have any magic, but Roberts kind of adds to the layers of the meaning of the word powerless, showing that it's not just about her magic, it's also about like her class within this system, her like ability to be able to fight and survive, and also like in her proximity to Kai and their relationship. So I liked the layers of that, especially in the first half. I just feel like it got a little bit more surface level, and that didn't actually really get developed much more in the second half of the book, which was kind of a bummer. It just stayed like pretty kind of surface level. One One of my favorite parts was definitely the world building at the beginning. I thought Roberts did a great job of immersing us into the slums and kind of showing how Peyton has managed to survive for years, and definitely giving a nice picture of the environment. But as the plot kind of picked up in the second half, I felt like a lot of that richness kind of faded. The world building definitely dwindled, and the second half really just became more about like moving the plot forward than continuing to like deepen the setting alongside of that. So that was kind of a bummer. Let's talk about the romance, because this book is very much driven by the romance at its core. It is a romantasy. Peyton and Kai, their relationship. I'll admit there were definitely some cringy moments that I tabbed, but I mean, it's kind of a YA staple at this point. I feel like there's few series that manage to escape that, but overall I did definitely enjoy the longing between them. I thought it was really strong, and that was definitely kind of the best part of their relationship throughout this novel for me. The frustrating part though was kind of how their dynamic played out. It was just scene after scene of them having these moments of proximity and like flirting, getting close, and one person would like usually instigate it, reach out and make it very clear like, I'm attracted to you, and then the other person would kind of like pull away and pretend like nothing was going on and be avoidant, and we didn't really get enough internal dialogue from that avoidant person to explain why they were doing it. It was sort of just like blocking out everything that was happening with no explanation why. It was just kind of annoying. Like, it's not my favorite romantic trope to read about. So overall the relationship felt kind of like oddly slow, even though they were having a lot of these moments where they were having these like charged moments. For that reason I loved the tension, but payoff wasn't very strong for me. I kept wishing for more, and I kind of, especially at the end, wish there would have been a little bit more for them in that aspect. Character-wise, Peyton and Kai both had great arcs, good character development, especially in, well, really all throughout the book, I think. And even Kit had some good development to an extent, but pretty much every other character fell pretty flat for me. The one that stood out to me the most was Dina, Peyton's best friend, who she lived with in the slums for years and who comes with her to the castle. Her character arc could have been so much more impactful, but she just was not integrated enough into the story to make it really land at the end. There was like 3, maybe 4 like overall points or moments in the book that she participated in, and this is her best friend. It's almost like she didn't exist at all, and that was kind of annoying for me. Also, small side note, I was kind of annoyed about how one of the like villain characters in the trials, she got referred to as a bitch kind of a lot. She was the only character, and it mostly was coming from male characters calling her that, and that kind of pulled me out. I didn't really appreciate that very much. I don't know, I really don't love it when women get called bitches by men. That's kind of annoying. And my last kind of nitpick is that the pacing was a little uneven as well. There were some sections that I feel like dragged, and then there were other times where we would have these kind of abrupt transitions between like scenes or like chapters beginning. I feel like the moments in between that were just kind of lost. It was just a little bit weird. I think that happened like 2 or 3 times where I was kind of taken out, like, what the heck just happened? Like we just skipped a lot of time. It wasn't enough to like ruin the book for me, but it did make the flow feel kind of choppy in places. But overall, this was a great debut novel. I can see why it's so popular, and even though I had critiques of it, I'm definitely invested enough to keep going. I already bought the second book, so I'm excited to read it. I'll have to read it after this challenge is over, but I am definitely excited to see where it goes. The ending of the first book leaves a lot open-ended, like a lot to still kind of reckon with. I'm curious to see where we go in the second book, like how Roberts expands the scope of the story or like where it takes us. If she can balance out more of like the world building and the character arcs a bit more, then I think this series has potential to be really strong. And I'm excited to see what happens for Kai and Peyton next. And it's shorter than the first book too, so I'll be able to get through it pretty quick. That was Powerless. I gave it 4 stars because I really, enjoyed it despite my nitpicks for what it is, for a YA fantasy, for a debut novel. I thought that it was great. I enjoyed reading it and had a fun time, and I'm excited to keep reading. So yeah, we are now 66% of the way through this challenge. And next up, I'm reading The Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. I hope that's how you pronounce his name. You can see I already started it this morning, and it's been very interesting so far. I wanted to read this next because I want to save Toni Morrison for last. I just feel like that is the most appropriate way to finish off this challenge. And I didn't want to finish with a nonfiction because I felt like that'd be boring. So I'm going to read this next. It's thin and there's a lot of pictures in it, so I think I'll probably be able to read it pretty quickly this weekend, and then I will let you guys know my thoughts when I'm done. So I'll check it back in with you probably in a couple days. All right, hello. It is Sunday, September 21st, and we did it. I finished both Sula and The Architecture of Happiness, and I'm here to break down my thoughts on both of them, as well as just kind of do a reflection on how the last month and a half has been reading these books, because I'm surprised it took me longer to read these than I thought it would. I've been reading at about my normal track record. It's just that normally when I have a challenge or like a collection of books that I want to read for a video, I tend to read a little bit faster just because I'm excited to finish them and kind of get my thoughts out about them. But I really took it pretty slow with this challenge, and that's not a bad thing, just something that I have been thinking about. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that they were all so widely variable in genre, and I'll kind of touch on that later on towards the end of the video. But I'm going to start with breaking down my thoughts on The Architecture of Happiness. I finished this like over a week ago, I think, a week and a half ago. I just have not really gotten around to filming to talk about it because I had a really crazy week, so apologies that it's kind of happening at the end. But the basic premise of this book is that the spaces that we live in and the buildings that we kind of surround ourselves with have a very profound influence on us, our emotions, and like our sense of well-being. Botton is actually a philosopher, and he's also a writer, and he's known for kind of, I guess, blending philosophy with everyday life, so it makes sense that he chose architecture as a topic to kind of talk about in that way. And in this book, he kind of explores how architecture connects to happiness. He kind of approaches it from different angles. He talks about like the historical influence, he talks about obviously the psychological influence, and then there's a lot of also personal anecdotes along the way. I picked this one up, as you guys know, I talked about it already, but I love design. I mean, it's my job, it's what I do for a living, and I have always been drawn to it because of the way that design can influence us, like intrinsically. It is so fascinating to me that you can step into a space and feel completely different than you did outside of it. Just that like emotional connection between people and their spaces. And I was really hoping that this book would dive more into that in the sense of like the data behind that. Like I kind of wanted to maybe talk about like color theory or the psychology of space, like that kind of thing. It definitely leaned more heavy on Botton's kind of like his travels, and there was again a lot of historical background on how like history has shaped architecture, which I did think was interesting. I didn't feel like there was a very strong narrative thread throughout the entirety of the book, like that carried me from beginning to end. The sections often felt like they kind of jumped around, so for that reason I kind of struggled to feel like propelled forward or pulled forward to the end in order to finish. It kind of was a little bit all over the place. On top of that, I will say Botton's writing style is very flowery, which I'm not always opposed to. Like there are some people who can do flowery that's like very dense and there's a lot there to unpack. This was more in the sense to me of like he was saying something that I could say in one sentence in 12 sentences. Like it was a lot of repetition where he was really hammering one point home through a lot of verbiage and language that I was like, okay, I kind of already got like what we're working towards. Like we could move on. That being said, I will say there are a lot of really thoughtful insights that I found in this book. I have a bunch of quotes that I do want to read, and I feel like there were some perspectives that he had that are still very much relevant today, if not more so. But I just think overall they were a lot fewer and more far between than I was expecting. So I feel like overall it just didn't deliver quite what I was hoping for. It's not to say that it was a bad book. It just wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be when I started to read it. I still thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would say that it is a beautifully written reflection of like architecture and its relationship to human happiness and like to our feelings. But I would say if you're looking for something like me that's a little bit more practical, more research based, this may not be it. But all that being said, I did give it 3 stars. I feel like in general nonfiction is difficult for me. It really has to be a topic that I'm super interested in. I talked about this in my review of Hold Me Tight, and this was definitely something I was interested in. The execution was just a little bit off, so for that reason I got 3 stars. But I do want to share some really interesting quotes with you guys because, like I said, there's some very beautiful insights in this book. In the first chapter on page 11, he says, "A thought-provoking number of the world's most intelligent people have disdained any interest in decoration and design, equating contentment with discarnate and invisible matters instead." I thought that was very apropos, very funny. In that same section, he kind of talks about what it is like to see and consume beauty, those of us who do it often and some who may be more closed off. He says, "Professions of detachment that stem not so much from an insensitivity to beauty as from a desire to deflect the sadness we would face if we left ourselves open to all of beauty's many absences." I loved that perspective. I feel like I do this. Like sometimes I sort of just block out all of the non-beautiful things because sometimes it feels like it can become too much to bear to notice how much of an absence there is of beauty in the world sometimes. I thought that was a really interesting perspective, not one that I've really considered or kind of like thought about in that way before. And again, talking about beauty, he says, "It is in dialogue with pain that many beautiful things acquire their value. Acquaintance with grief turns out to be one of the more unusual prerequisites of architectural appreciation." I definitely thought that was an interesting perspective too, that you might appreciate beauty more if you have experienced pain. Overall, that seems to make sense to me. And this is my last one. This one's a little bit long, so bear with me, but it was my favorite section by far. He says, "When only a millimeter separates a lethargic set of the mouth from a benevolent one, it is understandable that a great deal should seem to hang on the differing shapes of two windows or roof lines. It is natural for us to be as discriminating about the meanings of the objects we live among as we are about the faces of people we spend time with. To feel that a building is unappealing may simply be to dislike the temperament of the creature or human we dimly recognize in its elevation. What we search for in a work of architecture is not in the end so far from what we search for in a friend. The objects we describe as beautiful are versions of the people we love." I love that last sentence. I thought that was my favorite quote in the whole book. And he even kind of illustrates that with literal pictures, illustrations of different types of mouths, different faucets, different chairs, different lines, to kind of illustrate that we react to them differently. And he's kind of surmising that it is because we see traits reflected in those things very abstractly that remind us of people we love. I thought that that was just so cool. I loved that. Now I look at a beautiful piece of crown molding and I'm like, I wonder what person that I love I'm seeing in this. It's so silly, but I really, really love that perspective. So that was The Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. And now we must talk about Sula, because I finished Sula a couple days ago, and wow, this book is quite a doozy. I have so many feelings about this book. I think it took me just under a week to read this, which is crazy because this book is only like 170 pages long. And I'll tell you why. It's because one thing Toni Morrison does is she does not waste a sentence. This book is very, very dense with knowledge and commentary and thoughts about the world. It was a lot to take in, and I tend to read books like that very slowly because my small brain needs a big time to process. At its heart, Sula is a story about two women, and it's a story about their friendship, betrayal, and kind of the ways that women carve out space for themselves within a society that does everything that it can to like constantly try to define and contain them within boxes. It is set in a Black community in Ohio called the Bottom, and it's about these two characters, Nell and Sula, who are friends who like grew up together but ultimately take like very different paths in life. So there are parts of the novel where they spend, years apart, and then they kind of come back together and reflect on the past, and it is kind of a lot of that sort of back and forth, and it's kind of an exploration of how the different choices that they make end up, influencing the kind of women that they become. And through not just their story, but some of the other women around them, Morrison is exploring themes of like female friendship, of definitely generational trauma, independence, like more specifically independence from men, and kind of what it looks like for Black women to exist outside of the roles that society prescribes for them. I loved the world building in the first chapter where she explains how the Bottom ended up getting its name and how Black people ended up settling there. The way that this white farmer tricked that man by calling it the bottom of heaven because it's up on a hill, so it's the closest to God in this town of Medallion, and so it's called the Bottom, and it's just a joke to them. Like, they call it that because none of the white people want to live there. It has bad farming land, but they trick this community into moving up there. It was so clever and also devastating. Like, from the very beginning, Morrison is able to very clearly distinguish this sharp divide between the way that white and Black people regard the land differently and like what that land means to each group. I thought it was just a distinction that was so well drawn. It was so poignant, and it was just so silly. And the way that the novel ends and kind of what ends up happening to the land, I just felt like was very apropos. Something else that I loved was the exploration of PTSD within Shadrach's character, most specifically. It was so layered. One metaphor in particular blew my socks off on page 8, where he kind of talks about fighting in World War I, and he's in combat and he witnesses a soldier who gets his head shot off or blown off, and he says, "But stubbornly, taking no direction from the brain, the body of the headless soldier ran on with energy and grace, ignoring altogether the drip and slide of brain tissue down its back," which is is so gruesome, but to me, it was the perfect metaphor of what PTSD can be. This body is stubbornly taking no direction from its brain that is gone. It continues to run on for however many steps, ignoring, the brain sliding down the back. And to me, that metaphor really struck me as just like a physical manifestation of trauma and PTSD, that your body just acts without connection to your brain. It's like those ties are severed. And she illustrates that with a very visceral metaphor that just hits you in the face. I loved it. That kind of circles back to my point about how Toni Morrison does not waste a single sentence in her books. This is the only the second book of hers that I've read, but I feel like it is very much her style to have this very dense sort of prose, and that's what makes her writing so powerful. But also for someone like me, it can make reading her books difficult. Like I said, it took me quite a while to finish this book just because you have to be extremely present when you're reading. You have to give this book your full and undivided attention, which as someone with ADD, that is very difficult for me. Every line matters, every word carries weight. You are constantly going to be annotating. There's a lot to kind of parse through here. And I will admit that it is challenging for me in particular as a reader, but that's why I like to read her books, because I find them challenging, and it just makes it all the more special when you're able to kind of break through and have that wonderful realization. So it's very clear why Toni Morrison is as highly regarded as she is as a classic writer. She is incredible with her prose, but I don't find it to be too unapproachable even for those who may not typically read classics or literature like this, because the sentence structure and the overall vocabulary is still very much approachable for anybody to read. Okay, moving on from that aside, our introduction to Nell and her mother I also loved. I feel like Toni Morrison sets up everything that we need to know about Nell from that very first section. The way that she reacts to sort of her mom getting on this train with her and the whole day of what ensues between them. It so clearly indicates this formation happening inside of her, of this theme of independence, and really kind of drives home a lot of the choices that I feel like she makes later in the novel. I also think it's interesting how Nell is the one who kind of first starts this theme that carries through the book of independence at that point from her mother, and yet it's eventually Sula who really takes that thread and just runs right on and lives out that independence a lot more fully. Their flip-flopped trajectories kind of become a permanent dynamic between them. So it creates both this connection but also this distance. It's this weird little dance that they do for the entirety of the book, and it's that tension between them that drives so much of the novel forward. And while the story really does center on Sula and Nell and their relationship, it's also about Hannah, Sula's mom, and Ava, Sula's grandmother, and how these four women again exist independently within the community in ways that often sort of unsettle or disrupt expectations of those around them. I think Toni Morrison says in her foreword or the introduction that those four women are the 4 points of a cross. And I especially loved watching Sula's arc unfold in part 2 of the book, where she sort of starts to become this enigma for the townspeople. There's this sense of her becoming larger than life, almost like she's being mythologized. And it actually reminded me so much of Gregory Maguire's Wicked, which I just read at the end of last year, in the sense of an individual who is really just acting in their own rights, sort of against the norm of society, how that person becomes kind of a symbol and how people end up regarding them and talking to and about them. I just thought that was such an interesting parallel. If you've read those 2 books, I'm curious if anybody else caught that sort of similarity between them. I personally loved it. And the last thing I'll say is the last conversation that Nell and Sula have together towards the end of the book was by far and away my favorite part of this book. It is gut-wrenching. Their attempt to reckon with the past and their choices and their pain and the bond that kind of still ties them together. It was just so raw and it was so heartbreaking. And then of course Morrison closes the novel with one of those endings that just absolutely knocks the wind out of you. Like I said, this is only the second Toni Morrison book I read. I read Song of Solomon a long time ago, and even though it has been years, almost a decade since I read that book, I still fairly often think about the very last page of that book, even not remembering really anything else that happened in that book. That is just what Toni Morrison does, is she is able to leave a lasting impression on you that makes you close the book and be what am I feeling right now? What did I just read? It really prompts these moments of reflection, and just for me it was sadness and despair. She has the ability to write endings that just linger. They make you sit with them long after the book is over, and Sula is no different. I was trepidatious just in the beginning, but by the end of this novel, I was fully hooked. For that reason, I gave it 5 stars. I had a feeling that I would, but you know, like I said, it can be dense and kind of hard to process at times for someone like me, but I just loved it. The last thing that I want to read is a small quote from the foreword that Toni Morrison wrote, where she says, "Outlaw women are fascinating, not always for their behavior, but because historically women are seen as naturally disruptive, and their status is an illegal one from birth if it is not under the rule of men. In much literature, a woman's escape from male rule led to regret, misery, if not complete disaster. In Sula, I wanted to explore the consequences of what that escape might be, on not only a conventional Black society, but on female friendship." And that's the end of the foreword, and then it just shoots you right into the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be a ride, and it certainly was a ride. So highly recommend Sula, 5 stars. This was my second 5-star book of this video, so that is a 33% 5-star rate. That's pretty good, I would say, considering that I haven't read a 5-star book in quite a while. So, and that is it. We did it. We read all 6 books that I bought from Powell's in its various floors and locations. You know, one of the things that really kind of struck me as I was putting this video together is just how wildly different these 6 books are, like I kind of mentioned in the beginning. I didn't really plan it that way when I was browsing Powell's. It just kind of happened that I picked 6 books that were so unlike each other. But looking back, I do think that that is what makes this haul feel so special, because, like, again, Powell's is just magical. If I want to sort of reflect back on what this whole experience has been like from, you know, the very beginning. Powell's is like this endless maze of shelves where you can wander for hours, turning a corner and suddenly finding something you wouldn't expect. It truly is like a maze. It's hard to find your way around in there sometimes, but I always think that it has this ability to give you something that you were not necessarily looking for. And there is this almost childlike joy in like allowing yourself to get lost in it and wander. And I think that is part of what makes Powell's so unique. You don't just go in with a list and leave. Like, you go in open to discovery, open to this sense of wonder and like knowledge seeking. That I feel like is at the core of kind of every bookstore in my opinion, but Powell specifically has just something that other places do not have. And I don't know what it is. If I wanted to take a lesson from this book, I would say that the way in which it's designed informs those behaviors in us. It's like a maze to uncover, like adding to that childlike sense of wonder. But yeah, Powell's just has this way of reminding you that there is something out there for literally every single person, even people who don't like to read. There is something there for them, whether it is, in my case, philosophy, literary fiction, romance, YA fantasy, design theory, or even like modern classic. Like, I really ran the gambit, and you can find it all there under one roof, times many more than that. And the fact that I walked away with such a variety of books without even trying just really goes to showcase that. And it shows how expansive and diverse their collection is. Again, if I'm getting deep, I think that it made me realize that reading does not have to look one specific way. The books that we choose to read can be as layered and as multifaceted as we are. And there really is, like, there can be so much joy in finding one that meets us where we are at in that moment, that like really speaks to us in a certain time. And for me, these 6 completely different books made me feel completely different things, gave me completely different takeaways. They were all unique in their own way, and they all reminded me of why I love reading so much and why I even do it in the first place. So if nothing else, I hope that this video may have inspired you to pick up a book that is new or maybe unexpected for you, something that you might not normally reach for, because you truly never know what perspective or what feeling that it might leave you with. Even for me, like, that was nonfiction. I don't usually pick up nonfiction, but I still had a lot of fun with these books, even though they weren't like perfect 5-star books. Not everything has to be perfect. We don't always have to be searching for best of the best, the ultimate high, because if we do that, I really feel like we're limiting ourselves to what really is out there, what new perspectives that we can learn. If we're constantly reinforcing the same feelings and thoughts and tropes and whatnot into our brains, we're not really challenging ourselves. And that's kind of what this video was from the beginning. For me, was a challenge to step out of the box and try something new. So with all that being said, I really enjoyed getting to put this video together and just getting to read, because that's what I love to do. It was a very magical experience for me. And if you ever get the chance to visit Powell's yourself, just know that it is impossible to leave without discovering that magic for yourself. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked it, leave a like and consider subscribing for more content like this. I hope it was all worth it, considering how many previous videos I have talked about this video in, but I really, like I said, can't express enough how much fun I had putting it together. So hope you guys enjoyed it too. And yeah, that's it. See you later. Bye.